All right, let's go ahead and get started tonight. Tonight we're beginning a 5-week series of presentations leading up to the presidential election. Tonight we welcome John Geer back to Woodmont. Next week, Dr. Carol Swain. The next week, Susan Jellissen from Belmont, followed by Larry Bartels, another colleague of John's, and then Marc Hetherington on November the 2nd. The election is November the 8th. A few introductory comments to get us going before I reintroduce John Geer. As most of you know, Woodmont is a church that has political diversity. If you didn't know that, you just found it out. We have Republicans, we have Democrats, we have independents, we have people who don't know what the heck they are, and this has been the case for over 73 years, since this church was founded in 1943. While there are many churches that are politically homogenous, in this part of the country, this is not one of them. It's a part of the Christian church DNA that we agree to disagree. One of our sayings, in essentials unity, and non-essentials liberty, but in all things love or charity. Partisanship is a non-essential. Let me remind you that Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the most liberal presidents in our nation, was a member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Ronald Reagan, one of the most conservative presidents in our nation's history, was somebody who grew up in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. In fact, he grew up in Illinois and was childhood friends with my grandfather, with my dad's father, even though my dad said that my grandfather's sister later despised Reagan because of his politics. So there you go. I'll also remind you that the only president who was a minister, James A. Garfield, was a part of our denomination. And if you remember, Garfield was assassinated, but he was the only minister to serve as president. So we acknowledge political diversity, and that is a reality in our church and in our denomination, and we celebrate that. This year's presidential election is unprecedented in many ways. Many don't know what to make of it. Many just want it to be over. For political scientists like Dr. Geer, an election like this is fascinating, raising questions like, how did it happen? How will it turn out? Is Donald Trump crazy? Can Hillary Clinton be trusted? What is the current state of politics in this country? Why is there such polarization? And what will it take to restore civil dialogue in our nation? So in this series, we're going to welcome a variety of people, and they will bring differing perspectives to this conversation. And the goal is to be exposed to differing points of view because that is very important at this particular time in our nation's history. So that being a way of saying, I don't want a bunch of emails. I want you to come and listen. I want you to ask hard questions, and I want us to be exposed to different perspectives. Tonight, we welcome John Geer back to Woodmont. We've had the privilege of having him speak a couple of times in recent years. His wife, Beth, is also here. Beth, he promised me he's taking you out to dinner after this, so I just want to plant that for you. John is currently the Vice Provost of Academic and Strategic Affairs at Vanderbilt. He earned his Ph.D. from Princeton in 1986. He secured his B.A. from Franklin and Marshall College in 1980. John has published 5 books and over 20 articles on presidential politics and elections, and he recently served as editor of the Journal of Politics from 2005 to 2009. His most recent book is In Defense of Negativity, Attack Ads and Presidential Campaigns, published by the University of Chicago Press, which won the Goldsmith Book Prize from Harvard in 2008. He has provided extensive commentary in the news media on politics, including live nationwide interviews for Fox, CNN, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, ABC, and NPR. He's also written op-ed pieces for Politico, The Washington Post, The LA Times, USA Today, and the Chicago Tribune. It's great to have him back. Would you join me in welcoming back John Geer?
So is this mic working? People are able to, I can hear it's working. Okay, some sense. I want to stress that. Do not expect me, I reject the title, I'm going to make sense of this election, because that's not possible. Frankly, during the course of the talks that I've been giving around the country, usually you always have water, but this one has led me to have something often stronger than water for my talks. But And I say that partly because this has been, from a political scientist point of view, an amazingly fun election. It has so many different twists and turns. And for those of you, as Clay was just talking about, who are partisans one way or the other, those twists and turns probably cause you a lot of angst and anxiety. I'm not sure that I'll ease any of those things tonight. But what I really will try to do is to make sense of the election in the sense of bringing to bear what political science has to say. You actually have an amazing lineup of people speaking. I mean, for example, at the end of your series, you have someone like Larry Bartels. Larry's the best political scientist of his generation in the country. I mean, he's an amazing person. Marc Hetherington is also. So you'll be able to get a lot of different perspectives. And what I want to try to focus on today is move beyond what I would call the media blather. Can we go ahead and get to the second slide? Actually, I can see it up here. That helps me. So what I mean by the media blather is that we all know the media is 24/7. It used to be the evening news and the morning newspapers, really two different cycles within a given day. Now it's constant. And they have to feed the beast. They have to find stories. Last week, over the last, let's say, 10 days, there have been a lot of amazing stories. There was the first debate. There was then the continuation of attacks on this woman who was former Miss Universe. Donald Trump was tweeting at 3 in the morning. You then had his income taxes coming out. You had a vice presidential debate. There's been a lot of things going on that keep the news media interested, and it keeps all of us maybe on the edge of our seats, but it's missing the larger structural point. That is that this election can be explained, not all of it, but a good part of it, by just stepping back and trying to take a broader look at what I would call the structural features of the election. There's this class I'm teaching right now, 300 strong at Vanderbilt. It's the only one that's that large. But we do it every 4 years. And teaching it with John Meacham, a guy named Josh Clinton, who's in political science, who's co-directs the Vanderbilt poll with me, and Bruce Oppenheimer. And we really are trying to get the kids to stop focusing on the day-to-day media stuff, because it'll make you crazy. It's like trying to follow the stock market on a day-to-day basis. It's going to, up and down, up and down. But in fact, it has an explainable pattern in general, and same with elections. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So what structural forces am I going to talk about? You can go ahead and just put those up, and I'll talk about them in order. There's 5, I think, clicks that you can hit. One is the economy. The second, just go ahead and hit that. Can you hit that again? And if we hit it again? There we go. 2 terms for Obama. Just go ahead and hit those each, and I'll just go through them. There are structural features in this campaign that is driving it. One is the economy. The second, which we'll talk about extensively, maybe not extensively, is that Obama's in his second term, which means that the country likes change. One of the empirical facts of American politics is that we change parties in the White House every 8.3 years. That's just part of the rhythm of American politics. People like change. And that's, in fact, the strongest thing that Donald Trump has going for him. He is, in fact, an agent for change. Now, some people may not think it's good change, but he definitely represents change. For a lot of people, he's just going to blow up the process, and they want that because they don't think the system works. The economy works a little bit for Hillary Clinton. And the reason I say that is that the economy is growing. Unemployment's down. Yes, there are problems in the economy. There's no debate, and we're going to get to that in a second, the anger. But actual aggregate growth in the economy is taking place, and that structures elections. In 2012, it was very clear to political scientists for a long time that Barack Obama was going to win re-election. The reason why is the economy was growing, and he was a first-term president. The country doesn't turn out many first-term presidents. And so those combinations gave him an edge. He was going to win about 51, 52% of the vote, and that's exactly what he ended up winning. Those structural features drove the election. But I want to talk about a couple of other ones in this particular talk. One is the anger out there in the country. There is real palpable anger on so many different fronts. And Clay and I were talking earlier that Bernie Sanders came at it from one way, anger at the very rich, and of course, Trump is coming at it from a different angle, anger at Washington and the fact that government has screwed so many different things up. There's real anger out there. Fourth thing that I want to talk about is a change in the information environment. Trump has done some really important things that if he ends up winning this contest, which at the end of it I'll make a prediction just because it's fun. Don't hold me to it. But he's changed the information environment in some interesting ways that are worth talking about. And then finally, another structural feature, which again, all of you are aware of, is the changing demographics of this country. And it's really important to keep those things in mind as we see change continuing to unfold. And demographic changes are gradual, but it does change the way the election's going to work. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Don't worry about these numbers. What this basically says is that we can predict, that is, political scientists can predict the outcome of presidential elections with basically 90% accuracy with three simple variables. One is how popular is the sitting president. That's a measure of satisfaction with the incumbent. Second is the second quarter growth of GDP. That's that aggregate indication in the economy. And then finally, are you in the first term or not? Which I mentioned that really worked to Obama's advantage. It's right now working against Hillary Clinton. The first two things work for Clinton's advantage. Obama, actually, his popularity has really increased over the last year. His popularity is now sitting at over 50% in most polls. In some cases, it's been as high as 57, 58. His unpopularity, there's nobody undecided about Obama. You either like him or you don't like him, but his popularity has been moving up for two reasons. One, I think, is simply that the economy is doing better. The second is that the public probably is taking a look at the alternatives and they're beginning to miss Obama already. Just a hypothesis. He certainly said that in some quarters. And second quarter GDP growth again matters as well. So we'll return to this equation, but these three variables, which have nothing to do with the campaign, have nothing to do with the 24/7 news cycle, whether somebody did well in a debate or somebody didn't do well in a debate. These are structural features that we can actually measure in June prior to the election, and it predicts with 90% accuracy what's going on in the election. So we'll return to the specific estimates later. So if we can get to the next slide. So let me talk a little bit about middle class anger and just give you some data. Again, many of you not only know this, but in many cases, unfortunately, you feel this as well. Middle income households are just in the decline in this country. They were made up of 61% in 1971. It's dropped to 50%. There have been some recent indications, some recent data that suggests middle incomes are starting to pick up. But boy, it's been a long time. And the real problem is in the next graph. This is income growth for different rankings of income. So for the top 1%, middle 19, the next 19, middle 60, and the bottom 20%. As you can see, income growth among the very wealthy, that 1%, has increased 192% since 1980. That is basically means these individuals are beginning a 6% increase in their incomes each and every year since 1980. That's a pretty hefty increase. And it continues to add up and it accrues, and you can just see it's taking off in the charts. But look at the middle 60%. That's 41% growth. If you divide that, it's barely over 1% a year. 1% a year. So the income, and this is where these aggregate indicators of the economy pose some problems, because the growth of the economy is much more concentrated at the top. This is not a partisan figure. This is a reality. And this is a real problem. And our income inequality is at a really high point in this time in the country. And it's a concern. And both parties have to find a way to address it. So it's pretty easy to see why there's going to be anger. Let's go ahead to the next slide. This is way too small probably for people to read. Basically what this is saying is it's the changing face of information. People over 65 are still getting their news mostly from cable news and network news. People who are 18 to 29, they're getting it from social media. Again, this is kind of obvious, but this is a sea change in how information is consumed, and it also speaks to what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, Donald Trump has actually set the agenda in this campaign through tweeting. That's not happened before. I mean, all the candidates are doing it, but he manages to capture the news cycle, partly because he says some amazing things on those tweets. But that's the genius. He's able to control the news cycle. And he's getting his information out very effectively, whether it's through social media or not, but it's really a big change. And we see this change playing out, especially among different demographic groups, different age groups. You'll also see it among rural versus suburban versus urban. That's going to make a difference as well. The rural areas tend to be a stronger area for Trump. Why? Because there's also more income struggles going on there. The growth hasn't been as great. He's playing to those kinds of groups really well. But we just see a sea change in how people are getting information. Basically what went on in the 60s, basically since the invention of television to the rise of the internet, basically we were getting information from a small set of news media outlets, and it was basically a top-down model. That's no longer the case. We get information from friends, from side to side, from up, from down. We get it from all angles, and we get numerous sources. One of the big problems I think faces this country is that people can tailor their news. I mean, again, when Clay made the comment about learning from different perspectives, in the 1960s, when some of you and your families were sitting down, or your grandparents or parents were sitting down to watch the evening news, that's all they had to watch, and they had to get the news, and it wasn't from a partisan source. Walter Cronkite was one of the most admired Americans of his generation, and his information was treated, and we've looked at it, it wasn't biased in any particular way, but it would often challenge people's views. But now people will set up a liberal set of information or a conservative set of information, and all it does is reinforce what you already think. And that's not how democracy works. It's not how we learn. I mean, if you think back in your own case about, for example, who was the best teacher that you ever had? It wasn't that teacher that said, oh, you were brilliant, don't change anything. It was that teacher who challenged you, who said, you're not doing very well in this, you need to write better, or you need to think better, you need to redo something. Somebody who really challenges you, who in a sense criticized you, who disagreed with you. I mean, those are the opportunities to learn, and we don't have that enough in this country, and it's a big problem. And you'll see later that we have very stable preferences right now, especially in regards to this election. People have kind of made up their mind, and I'm not sure they're going to come up with enough information that might counter it because of the way they set up their information environments, because you can now tailor it. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Another thing that's changed, and again, Donald Trump deserves a good deal of credit for this, is that there's been a real change in paid political advertising. It's been a subject that I've studied for a long period of time. And the normal presidential election is that both candidates are pretty talented, they have comparable teams, they have comparable amounts of money, and it's kind of like a heavyweight fight where they go to the center of the ring and they punch it out, and you don't really get much net effect. But in this case, Donald Trump has chosen to use his Twitter account and just control of the free media rather than doing through paid media. I'll be presenting you some data, but Clinton has been airing a very one-sided message through paid political ads. Only recently, within the last week, has Trump started to buy ad time. In fact, it's hard for Trump because one of the things the Clinton campaign did is that in a lot of the battleground states, they bought up all the time that they could up through the election to keep Trump from being able to buy time. It's actually pretty clever. They didn't know if they needed it or not, but they wanted to be sure that Trump didn't have access to it. It also tells you how much money the Clinton campaign has. They are very well funded. And this change, because again, Trump has dominated the narrative. It used to be the presidential ads would often dominate the narrative. They were the ones that drove the narrative. Journalists loved to cover political ads. Someone like Dan Balls from the Washington Post would cover these political ads and give them attention, but there's not much attention paid to political ads this year. I bet you almost none of you, first of all, we're in the state of Tennessee, so we don't get to see any because we're not a battleground state. But even during watching national news or whatever, they're giving very little attention to paid ads. That's a very big change. They were dominating the news from '88 to 2012. They really shaped the news coverage. But Trump is such a great story that you don't need political ads to cover anymore because you've got Donald Trump, and he's been driving it. And in so doing, he's recasting this information flow. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So since June, and these data run up to about September 25th, there have been over 200,000 ads aired in the presidential campaign. And look at where they're concentrated. No surprise, Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia. Only 4% have been on national cable, and almost all those were during the course of probably the Olympics. But the bottom line is that they're heavily concentrated in these states, and we can actually, believe it or not, track all these ads. There's a technology now through satellites where you can actually figure out what ad aired, when it aired, where it aired, what show it did, what position it did. Really pretty cool data. And a colleague of mine at UCLA, she and I are collecting all these data. But you can see this doesn't come as a surprise. But the next slide is a little bit more of a surprise. 82% of these ads have been by Hillary Clinton or her supporters, super PACs. Only 18% by Donald Trump and his supporters. This is very, very unusual. It's usually about 53-47, maybe 51-49. But in this case, he's allowed a one-sided message because Trump believes his free media coverage is really what's driving the contest. And I think, if my memory serves, the next slide highlights this. You don't need to know the numbers, but this is where Trump's genius kicks in. This is during the course of the primaries. This is not the most recent data, but it's basically going to tell the same story. Trump spent $10 million on ads during this period of time in the primaries. And look at the amount of attention he got in the free media. Basically the equivalent of $1.9 billion worth of free airtime coverage. That's what you call ROI, return on investment. But you've got to give him real credit, because look at Jeb Bush. Jeb spent $82 million in this time and he got $214 million. That's not a very good ratio compared to Trump's. This is where Trump is affecting the election, affecting the information flow, because he's dominating news. Even in last night's vice presidential debate, obviously he and Clinton are the topics, but it's like moths to a flame. People are just drawn to it. He is the political story of this decade. Probably since 2010. Prior to 2010, you still have to give Obama that edge. But if Trump wins the presidency, he will go down as one of the great stories, because he's changed things in so many ways. He just doesn't play politics by the conventional rules. How many people, by the way, have seen the Saturday Night Live skit on a few people on Trump? If you got to see it. It's just hysterical. Alec Baldwin has Trump nailed. In fact, Beth and I were speculating that Alec Baldwin is probably now a committed Trump supporter, because if he becomes president, Alec Baldwin is going to make a lot of money. Not a little bit, a lot of money. I mean, he has him down in a way that's Dana Carvey did George H.W. Bush. He's in that league. I mean, it's just wonderful. But again, all his mannerisms, all the things he's done, huge story, and it's really changed politics. And really, frankly, from my point of view, in really interesting ways. And we'll see if it all pays off in the final analysis. Let's go ahead and get to the next table. This is another structural feature that I think is really important to talk about in American politics. This is data from 1976. We were politically a competitive country in 1976. The white is an indication basically of competition. It's a county by county analysis. I did not collect these data, somebody else collected them. But you can see that there's a lot of competition through the Midwest, out to California, which is hardly competitive anymore. You've got states like Iowa, Missouri was viewed as competitive. The South was not. That was still one-party Democratic area at that time. But we had a lot of competition. And that was one thing that's important, because when you have competition, you've got two parties competing with each other, Democrats, Republicans. It forces more moderation. But when the parties aren't competing in the general election, they have to worry about the primaries. And that forces the candidates on the left to turn to the left and on the right to turn to the right. And that creates more polarization because we don't have the competition. Just think of our own state legislature. Most members of our state legislature, their fear is they're going to get primaried by somebody usually on the right wing. And so therefore they are going to be sure to cover that base and be very conservative in their policies, more so than they might actually want to be. Why? Because it's the only way to make sure that they continue to be reelected, because the general election is not a struggle. That's a big problem. Let's go into the next slide. This is the declining competition. That is, and now look at all of a sudden how much less white there is. This is data from 2004. If we collect it to the present, it's even less white. That is, that we have less and less competition, and that's causing problems. Now, most people will assume that this less competition is because of gerrymandering and the rigging of districts, et cetera, and that's certainly part of it. But another big part of it is what's called the big sort. People are moving to areas that are like-minded politically. So if I have a student, for example, and she has a job offer in Dallas, Texas, and another job offer, equal pay, decent, same benefits, in San Francisco, I can tell you which partisan she is. If she's going to Dallas, she's likely to be a Republican. If she's going to San Francisco, she's likely to be a Democrat. And people are moving based on this. In fact, one thing that's amazing statistic is in the 60s and the 70s, what parents worried about with their children when they were going to get married was, are they going to be the same religion? That was a big concern. Now it's the same party. I can remember when my daughter started dating the man that she ended up marrying, who was a great guy. One of the first things she said is, Dad, you know he's a Republican, right? I'm a Democrat. I'll admit my bias. He's right up front. But she felt she had to tell me that he was a Republican. You know, I didn't personally care, but she was a little worried that I would. But it's, again, the way things are going. We're so polarized that people are now more worried about the partisanship than the religion. The change on religion may be a good sign of acceptance and tolerance and all like that, but the partisanship's probably less so. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the changing role of demographics. Here's the popular vote from 2012 and the electoral vote count. As we know, Obama won 51-48. He received 332 electoral votes, and you can see the states that he won. And let's go ahead to the next. So, well, that's fine. One of the differences, can we go back there? I think it skipped some slides. Yeah, there we go. I'm not sure how that's happening. So a couple of things about the 2012 election. First of all, Obama won women by 10 percentage points. That gap is likely to be larger in 2016 between Clinton and Trump, and Trump really desperately needs to close that. Let's go to the second. Younger voters. This is actually an area where Clinton and Trump are struggling. We have some recent data from the Vanderbilt poll is going to be released tomorrow, and among this group, Gary Johnson is actually doing pretty well here in the state of Tennessee. The younger voters are not resonating to Trump or to Clinton, but they certainly resonated to Barack Obama, and he won those by 23 points. Clinton needs to shore up her support among this particular demographic. Let's do the next one. African Americans, no surprise, 87%. It may be larger in 2016, even though Barack Obama is not on the ticket. And the reason for that is that Trump has really alienated and played kind of race cards in a variety of ways, and that's just true. In fact, the best predictor of Trump's support is a measure of racial attitudes. It just is. People don't like those data, but the data are pretty rock solid. There have been some public opinion polls taken where they have not surveyed anybody who's black and who's going to vote for Trump. Nobody, not one person. That's an indication of very low support. He's tried to make some recent inroads into the black community, but I don't think he's been very successful. And there's long-standing loyalty within the African-American community to the Clintons. So I think that's a really steep uphill climb for him. Hispanic voters, again, no surprise. The Hispanic community is very heavily in favor of the Democrats in general. Clinton's struggling a little bit among this group compared to Obama. But at the same time, obviously, some of Trump's rhetoric has caused real problems. But this was a big, big gain. Let's go ahead to the next slide. This is a group that does not get enough attention as Asian Americans. Asian Americans are rapidly approaching 10% of the population. Obviously, in states like California, there's a very heavy Asian population, but across the country, it's growing. And this group has suddenly become very Democratic. And as that population size grows, it's another advantage that the Democrats have, because the Asian community has moved from being very split politically to being now pretty heavily Democratic. And it'll be interesting to see. I assume Hillary Clinton will capitalize on this as well. So this is just this just puts numbers to things that we already know. This country is becoming less white. 89% of the vote was whites in 1976. It's down to 72% in 12, and it's going to drop a little bit more, and that pattern's going to continue. Again, I'm just giving you numbers to make it more concrete. Let's go ahead to the next one. This is something that is interesting, is that, again, we're not talking about huge increases, but the female vote is increasing. That is, the tendency of women to participate has been growing, and it's going to get a little higher, I think, in this campaign, partly because all the attention, partly because we have the first female candidate to be a major party nominee. That is an amazing thing. Whether you like Hillary Clinton or not, it is an amazing thing. And between that and some of Trump's statements, the female vote may be even a little bit higher. If that's true, of course, given the gender gap, that's not good news for the Donald. Let's go to the next one. This, again, is just another measure of the ethnic minority vote is increasing. Went from 1 to 6 to 1 to 4, and that's just going to continue. We can kind of skip over that one. Again, this just gives you some numbers. The Hispanic vote is increasing dramatically, and it's going to continue. And again, one of the reasons why there's such a battle over the issues of those people who are not in the country legally is it has now real political implications. The Latino community used to be split, well, I'll show you the data in a little bit, but it's now very heavily Democratic. So among the reasons why the Republicans have doubts about this policy is that it has political implications. It's going to hurt them at the ballot box because those people are going to turn out. one could argue that if the Republicans led the charge on it, they might be able to bring more Latinos back into the party, and I think that actually would happen if they chose to do that. And here's a graph that actually highlights this point. This is the share of the Hispanic vote in presidential elections. The interesting election for me is 2004. President Bush understood that for the Republican Party to become the majority party, he had to build a multicultural coalition. He worked very hard at it. He understood it being from Texas. He and Karl Rove really had this idea of building this multicultural coalition. He ended up doing pretty well among the Latino vote in 2004. That support that he got probably was the difference in the election because he barely beat John Kerry. And then in 2005, once he won the presidency, he tried to institute immigration reform. And the right wing of the Republican Party vetoed that, killed it off, and it went down. And ever since then, the Latino community has been increasingly Democratic. And I can't imagine that this trend won't even be stronger in 2016, given the kinds of rhetoric that Donald Trump has engaged in. Let's go ahead to the next slide. This is the indication of voters versus eligible voters. This is partly that line, the eligible voters, is including people who aren't registered and who can't register because they're not legal. But you can see how much increase the share of the Hispanic vote could happen if they were able to register and vote. Again, this is a trend that worries right now Republicans, especially those who are trying to figure out if Trump loses, how do they put the party back together for 2020. Let's go to the next. So this is all of these structural features, whether it be demographics, whether it be the kind of the anger in a sense, the economy, all these things. Democrats have right now an edge in the Electoral College. 18 states have been won by the Democrats 6 elections in a row. That starts the Democrats, if you believe that pattern continues, with 242 electoral votes. They're only 28 away from winning the presidency. Republicans, by contrast, have only carried 13 states in the last 6 elections, and that gives them 102 electoral votes. They're way away from the majority of the 270, the magic number, so to speak. This is a problem the Republicans face. And no matter what you think about this election, the path that Trump has to winning the college is a narrow one. It is a narrow one. He has to win, get a straight, basically fill an inside straight in a lot of different ways. Is this the next slide? Okay, well, so all these structural features that I've been talking about, and the news media up and down talking about all the candidates, take a look at what this graph tells you. This has been from NBC News. This is polling data from Clinton, Trump, Johnson, Stein since early August, as the data say. This tells you a story of stability. It hasn't changed much. You see a little bit of narrowing in early September, but even that's basically noise, and then it starts to increase, but still a very small gap. We're talking about 3 to 4 points, but it's been a consistent one. The debates, all the discussion of the debate, maybe it moves some polls here and there, but basically, again, a period of stability. People are locked in. They like Trump, they don't like Trump. They like Clinton, they don't like Clinton. There aren't that many undecided voters out there. In fact, if you think about it, who at this point in time is kind of undecided? People have strong opinions both ways. The people who are undecided are people who just don't follow politics. Well, that's okay, but people who don't follow politics, guess what? They don't turn out. So that we have a large number of people who've made up their minds. Maybe some cataclysmic event can take place that would change them, but I don't even think another, God forbid, a terrorist attack would change things because it's not clear to me which direction it would. So the bottom line is that this is a very stable election. It's very predictable. Now the news media will talk about the highs and lows. I mean, last night at the vice presidential debate, that is a non-event. I mean, it's important to know that both these people are capable of stepping in as president. That's good to know. But it didn't change any minds. I talked to about 10 people today, and everyone who thought Kaine won were Clinton supporters. Everybody who thought Pence won were Trump supporters. That's no surprise. Both, I thought probably Pence did a little bit better than Kaine, but boy, talk about not much difference. It's such a different field than the presidential debate. But we know why that's the case. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So who will win? Well, if you put in Obama's approval rating, in the summer, go back to that equation. You go back to GDP growth, and the fact the third term is not a charm, and you add all those things, if you make a prediction, Hillary Clinton wins about 49.8% of the two-party vote, 50%. In other words, it's a tie. The structural forces suggest it should be a close election, which is just what that graph said, and it certainly is. The one thing that I want to point out that's a possibility, because of Trump's strategy, one thing that Trump's strategy does is it gets him a lot of media attention, and there's no doubt about that. But the free media attention is not targeted attention. It's just across the board. Hillary Clinton's strategy is through paid ads, and she's targeting in the battleground states. And one thing that we have seen a little bit is that the battleground states are a little bit more favorable to Clinton than what the national polls would predict, which is possible because of the one-sided message. So if you believe that the popular vote is going to be basically a tie, flip a coin, it's going to be very close. Clinton, with all those reasons before, has a real edge in the college, and she has a one-sided message. We could see, and I'm not predicting this, we could see a flip from 2000. That is, we know the Tennessee's own Al Gore won the popular vote, but did not win the Electoral College. Though one can, given what happened in Florida, one could certainly quibble with that statement, but we know that that's what happened, at least based on the vote counts. It could flip. Imagine Donald Trump the morning when he wins the popular vote, but loses the college. He would not, and this is just simply the truth, when that happened to Al Gore, he stood up and he conceded the election after the Supreme Court made its decision. That was probably the hardest thing he's ever done, because he knew in his heart other things should have happened, but they didn't. And for the sake of the country, he conceded the election. There is no chance Donald Trump would concede the election. He called a rigged system, it would feed into his narrative. He's been arguing that. It'd be a real problem. I mean, yes, Hillary Clinton would become the president and all like that. I think in the end, that earlier poll I said, I think Clinton probably wins this race. Not by a lot, and there's going to be some, closing moments when it gets a little closer, then it'll expand again. We'll learn a lot in the second debate. But the first debate didn't change very many minds. The second debate, unless Hillary Clinton does something really amazingly bad, or Trump suddenly has a metamorphosis overnight, I don't think it's going to change things very much. It'll continue to be a dogfight. The last couple of presidential elections have been dogfights, and this one is as well. And it's certainly been nasty in lots of ways. But at the end of the day, what I urge my students to think about, and I'd urge all of you, is take comfort in the fact that if the public supports somebody who you don't like, maybe the public's right. It's what a democracy is about. I have very clear memories on 2004. There was a very close election, and I came into the office, and this woman who was in the office next to me, she comes in, and she pops her head in the office. It's clear that she was a diehard Kerry supporter. Clearly, she'd been drinking all night, and she was very upset, and she starts yelling at me, "What are you so happy about? The country's going to hell, it's all terrible." And I said, well, I'm not so sure about that. First of all, I wasn't a huge fan of Kerry. And I said, look, our fellow citizens supported Bush. Maybe they're right. They've made pretty good choices over the course of American history. It's what democracy is about. I don't always agree with it, but at the same time, maybe we should just go with that. It was not an acceptable answer for this individual. But the point being that we just have to find some comfort in that if Donald Trump finds a way to reel in enough voters, and so far I don't think he's broken through this threshold, this kind of ceiling of 43, 44%, but if he somehow does, we have to acknowledge that maybe that's a good thing if you really believe in democracy. It'll test some of our beliefs in democracy because there's such strong opinions. But the country does want change. It badly wants change. And for good or bad, Trump is certainly a great catalyst for change. And I think that will be the story of the election. But again, I would, if I had to bet bet a little bit of money, I wouldn't want to bet a lot. That's a strong prediction for you. I'd go with Hillary Clinton. But again, focus on the structural forces. Don't pay attention to the 24/7 news blather, because they just get it wrong all the time. I mean, if you counted how many times did the media predict this will be the downfall of Donald Trump? This will be the downfall of Donald Trump. When he attacked John McCain, this will be the downfall of Donald Trump. When he supported David Duke, this will be the downfall of Donald Trump. When he went after a 4-star family, this will be the downfall of Donald Trump. Nope, he's still there. So with that, I will take any questions. I'm sure nobody has any questions about this race. Oh. There's a question over there.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Geer.
Are you going to read from a book here?
I'm reading from the book, yeah.
Okay.
Is that in the Changing Face of Information, that slide that you had up there, it's really interesting. Every age group was drawing primarily their information from cable TV. Obviously, the 18 to 29-year-old group is from social media.
Right.
Trump gets $2 billion worth of free media, as in one of the slides you had in there.
Right.
Is not the worry on Trump's camp that the 18 to 29-year-old may be a little bit more apathetic getting to the polls? That would, I mean, it seems like that would be, again, maybe the millennials are going to get a little bit more engaged than what historically you've seen, but.
You know, we can't be sure because this election has tested all our abilities to predict. But the millennials tend, the younger voters just tend not to vote. I mean, that's the big problem. I mean, Bernie Sanders faced that effect a number of times in the primaries. He had a lot of people turning out at rallies. He had a lot of interest, but the youth don't tend to vote, and that's a problem for the country, I think, in general. But the youth vote right now is not, it's not like it was with Obama, where they just loved Obama. I mean, there is some support for Hillary Clinton, but remember that the youth were excited by Bernie Sanders. I mean, that was the group that he really turned on. I mean, which is in of itself just fascinating to me. A 74-year-old socialist from Vermont. I mean, that's just really interesting. And the fact that he has white hair and bald, I mean, that gave me hope for the future. I mean, that maybe I could continue to teach and lecture and resonate with the kids. But the millennial vote is lots discussed. They're certainly getting their information differently, but they're not. They tend not to vote. So I think, Trump has to turn out all his supporters, and there's a lot of enthusiasm behind. Trump does have more enthusiasm than the Clinton camp, and that may help him on the turnout front. But Republicans tend to turn out anyways. The Democrats are always the one that have to do more turnout, and that's another thing that Clinton has going for her. She's built really impressive turnout machines in the battleground states. She doesn't need to worry about California, New York, for example, but in North Carolina and Florida, things like that, she's doing it.
Does your data collection model track the votes on a basis of government benefits to certain groups? Is there any evidence that their votes follow the receipts that they're receiving from government handout programs?
Yeah, there is some, government, basically, on average, Democrats tend to get more government benefits. Now, it depends on how you define benefits, right? Because you could talk about our tax policies being a benefit or the mortgage deduction being a kind of a benefit. But yeah, there's some evidence for that, but the data that I presented here doesn't tap any of that, and you'd have to have much more fine-grained kinds of data. But scholars have looked at that, and there used to be a school of thought that what presidents did, regardless of party, is that they would prime the pump. And that so Richard Nixon, I don't know if some of you may remember this, I remember from my grandmother, in I think it was October 1st of 1972, there was a nice big increase in her Social Security check. That was not accidental. Nixon understood that would help, and it looks like it may have made a little difference. So he didn't need any help in 72. I mean, he could have cut their pay and he still would have beaten the government. But yeah, there's some modest support, but my data don't speak to it.
Would you just discuss momentarily your idea of the fairness or unfairness of the electoral vote?
Well, the Electoral College is a bizarre system. It just is a bizarre system. And it favors, right now we have 7 states, I think it's 7 states that have 3 electoral votes. But they only have 1 representative to the House of Representatives. They're that small a population, like North Dakota, Vermont, those kinds of states. The entire state is a congressional district. And those states have more clout per person than a state like California. And so you can see why you do away with the Electoral College. But people have to be careful about doing that. Because as soon as you do away with the Electoral College, you're going to change the incentive structure, maybe for good things. But for example, right now, we know that Clinton and Trump are focused on states like Ohio and Florida, and that seems unfair to us in Tennessee. True. But imagine we did away with the Electoral College. Where would candidates seek votes? Where would they spend their time? California and in the urban areas, because that's where the votes would be. So I don't know that the rural areas could get really, hurt by this. I don't know that that's a good or a bad thing, because if you believe in one person, one vote, maybe that's the right thing to do. The other thing is that we are a federal system, so that states themselves deserve representation, at least was the founders' idea. And so this is one mechanism to do it. I said, if you want to do away with the college, which frankly, I'm sympathetic towards, but you also then have to think about, why do we have the U.S. Senate? I mean, it's a little bit of a crazy institution too. I mean, I always ask my class, does anybody from North Dakota? I don't know that anybody lives in North Dakota, right? I mean, there's just like nobody there, but they get 2 senators, the same number of senators that California gets. That's a little crazy. But if you believe in a federal system that the states need representation, and certainly the founders believe that, then there's a bit of a case. But the real problem, I think, for the college, and Trump's maybe blowing this up a little bit, is that not only do states like North Carolina and Florida get all the attention, but they also tend to get more information because those ads are informative. Good or bad, they are informative. And so citizens of Tennessee don't get as much information. And the other thing that the college does, which I really don't like, is that it incentivizes the national party to focus on a small set of states. So our state Democratic Party is not as functional as it should be because it doesn't get resources. Because Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are not counting on Tennessee to carry them to the presidency. And as a result, they don't invest in the state. And so this lack of competition comes back because of the logic of the college. Those are the things that bother me about it. But again, I just don't want, we got to be careful about these reforms because it introduces a new set of incentives that may come back to haunt us. Yes, ma'am.
I have been interested in your polling mechanism with people doing away with landlines and only having their cell phones. Do you all poll on the cell phones or the landline?
No, the Vanderbilt poll, which I co-direct with Josh Clinton, we're now doing 60% landlines. I'm sorry, 60% cell phones and 40% landlines. And that proportion's been moving up steadily, and it'll continue to move up. If you don't do cell phones, you don't get a very good sample. And it costs money to do that, but you've got to do it. So we spend a lot of time on making sure we get cell phones in the sample.
So the thing that you said about anger driving a lot of this election sure has resonated with me, just hearing, excuse me, so much of the rhetoric. And it seems like a lot of that translates into nationalism as well, not just in the United States, but in Britain and so many parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Do you see a rise in nationalism, both locally and globally? And what's your prediction for 4 years from now?
Oh, gosh. Okay, well, let me take I'm not a scholar of comparative politics, but yes, you're absolutely right that what went on in Britain, it's gone on in France, elsewhere. This is not just an isolated thing. It's going on in a lot of different countries. And so that again gets back to the fact that there's something structural here. It's not, Donald Trump has tapped into something. He got it, he understood it. One of the things someone told me, I forget who it was, within 2 weeks of the close of the 2012 election, he patented, let's make America great again. He was planning on this for a long time. And whatever set of mechanisms he has in his mind to make a decision, he chose this year. He had a pretty good sense of timing, and he tapped into that anger. So I think it's real, and it's across the board in a lot of different ways. Actually, you're having Larry Bartels come and speak 3-4 weeks or whenever it is. He's actually starting to study comparative democracies, and he might have some much better insights than I would have. 2020. First of all, for the Democrats to win a fourth term in a row, that's really hard. And it would require a very strong economy. And I think if there's a strong economy, then yeah, Hillary Clinton could win if she wins. But if Trump wins, and we don't know what, who knows what kind of president Trump would be. That's the thing that worries personally me, is that we don't have a good feel for it. Hillary Clinton, we kind of know what we're going to get. You may not like that, but there's a certain level of certainty, good or bad, to that thing. Trump, you don't have a feel for it. Though, the fact that he picked Mike Pence, that was a solid choice, and I certainly performed reasonably well. But, it so much depends on the economy. And if, Trump wins and the economy is doing well in his first term, that model will predict he'll win re-election. We'll see, but it's very hard to anticipate. We'll know the features that'll structure it. George H.W. Bush won in '88, but lost. It would have been 4 elections in a row that Republicans would have won. It just doesn't happen very often. So Hillary has a heck of a chance, frankly, if she wins, of being a one-term president. Yes, sir.
Just interested in your thoughts, given the anger in the electorate, changing demographics, et cetera, the potential for a third party at some point. It seems like Jerry Johnson had a potential until he put his foot in his mouth and
Yeah.
a couple comments. And with people so angry and so disgusted with both parties, that I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the anger level and the hunger among the public is clearly there for a third party. You're absolutely right. But our electoral rules make it very hard. It's no accident. Our parties don't agree about a lot of things, Democrats and Republicans, but they can agree that we don't want any third parties. There's consensus on that. They're on board with that. And so we have a lot of electoral rules that favor the two parties. So Ross Perot, 1992, wins 19% of the vote, doesn't win a single state, doesn't get any electoral votes. Gary Johnson doesn't even get a chance to be in the debates because he doesn't have 15% of the threshold. Who decided that? Well, the League of Women Voters, who's made up of Democrats and Republicans, and they just didn't want to give a third party a chance. But because we have what's called first past the post in like congressional elections and senatorial elections, it's hard for a third party to make a difference because basically you siphon votes off from somebody. The Republican Party in the 1850s can be thought of as a third party, and they became then a major party. So we can have change. And in fact, one of the great questions is if Trump wins, what happens to kind of traditional Republicans that, like a George H.W. Bush or a Vin Weber from Minnesota or whatever? What are these people going to do? Because they're not going to join Trump's party, and Trump's going to clean them out if he wins. So where do they settle? And they probably settle short term in some third party, but then eventually it would get absorbed because in the long run, it just is it's a big problem. And that's for good or bad, that's our political system. If we had a lot of parties, that poses problems because then the vote split and you can't get things passed. But we're not getting a lot of things passed now. Yeah.
Yeah, I get one in here. I'm curious that it seems like every election, both candidates say that they champion the middle class, and your graph that showed the 1% increase in wages over the past, whatever that time period is pretty amazing. Who champions the middle class? And if a lot of people will say, well, the Democrats, but yet Trump has made serious inroads with the working class people. So who really champions the middle class?
Well, I mean, inevitably that's kind of the answer tends to be a partisan one. I mean, if you think the Democrats or Republicans, I think both parties have done a bad job of it. And for whatever series of reasons, we know that the tax policy we have favors the wealthy in ways that aren't, holding aside whether Trump's a genius or not. I mean, he loses $1 billion and he doesn't have to pay taxes for 15 years or whatever. They haven't denied that part of the story. Look, he did nothing wrong, and I would have done the exact same thing if I'd have lost $1 billion. I don't know, that's a lot, but nonetheless, happened. I would have done the same thing, but our tax policy allows that. I don't know that that's a good or a bad thing. And so, but getting that kind of reform through is really hard because of our political system. And the political system is good at keeping things from happening. The founding fathers set it up that way. And both would claim that they champion the middle class. There have been nonpartisan groups that have analyzed both platforms. You know, what Trump claims for his tax policy, same with Clinton and job policy. Most people think Clinton would have a better policy, but boy, that's hard to predict. I don't think many people anticipated the growth that we saw under Ronald Reagan, and we did. And it was, you know, again, a lot of the wealthy benefited, but there was some growth in the middle class. But we're right now, some of the structural features starting to ease up. I mean, there's been recent data that suggests the middle class has been doing well, that maybe finally, after way too long a time, that some of the changes that came out after 2008 and just kind of natural business rhythms is starting to pick things up. But that's the optimistic interpretation based on a shard, and I say that seriously, a shard of evidence. Yes, sir.
So my question, it's more about time than anything. So you had said that in this election, everyone knows which side they're on. That seems to be the case to me. So is that more true at this point in time now than in past elections? And do people decide earlier this time? And then as a follow-up to that, if that's true, is there a point historically where you can say the die is cast? People know who they're going to vote for, and that's mid-October, that's early September?
I mean, the country has fewer undecided voters right now than it has for quite a while. The country's polarized. It's true for the parties. It's true for the public. You know, partly if you ask people, the growth of self-identified independents has actually increased, which you think those people would be undecided. But people who are self-identified independents, they tend to vote for only one party. So they really are partisans. They just don't want to kind of admit it because they're at one level kind of disgusted with the party, but they still go with that choice. So we do have fewer, and at a certain point, I don't think we're going to get much more polarized. I mean, you know, maybe you think Clinton will do that or Trump, but we're already pretty polarized. I don't think either one of them is going to make that worse. But at some point, the political system, something will happen and it'll start, you know, it's kind of been pulling apart. Something will cause it to come back together. These things oscillate. If you look over the long period of American history, we have measures of polarization in Congress, and it was really high in the late 1800s, and then it started to decline, and then it's been on the rise again. Something will cause it to go down. The real key, get back to that graph, we need more political competition. That's what we really desperately need. And to some degree, that's going to require people to change their moving patterns. And if we can get that, I think that would really change, because competition is really important. We have a two-party system. You might want to have more parties, but if you have two competitive parties, at least you have differing views. And no one party has all the good ideas. I mean, that's just not, you know, I think that's true. The Republicans have been right about some things. Democrats have been right about other things. But it's the competition between the two that have been critical, and that's been declining. And we also have somehow compromise got changed in its conceptual foundations. Not sure how this happened. It used to be the compromise, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan had to compromise on taxes and Social Security. I mean, both had to swallow things they absolutely hated to get the reform for Social Security through. They couldn't stand it, their supporters didn't like it, but they did it. Today, compromise is you find things you agree on and you call that compromise. That's not compromise. That's just things that there happens to be consensus. The parties have gotten away from that, and they're not willing to, partly because, again, that lack of competition, because they're more fearful of their primaries than they are of the general election. And that's true for our state legislature. It's true for Congress. I mean, right now I can tell you of the 435 congressional districts, 380 are already settled. Talk about being locked in, they're done. I mean, we know who's going to win those. There's just a handful that are competitive. It should be a lot higher, a lot higher. Yes, sir.
Kind of some follow back up here. It seems that there's a lot of discourse. I mean, I know myself, I'm sitting here going, I'm going to vote. I'll hold my nose and vote, whichever way it goes. But kind of back to the third party, do you think there's a point in time where there's enough people that are dissatisfied that whoever gets in might get in for a term and it swap parties and they get in for a term? Unless something changes, that they do something for the true good of the country? That it just flops every 4 years?
Yeah, it could. I don't.
Where's the money to?
Yeah, I mean, the country responds to the economy. And so that if somebody, you know, and the economy has its own rhymes and rhythms. you know, the 15 million jobs created under Obama are not because of Obama's policies. It's partly because of the crash and then coming back. Some part are due to his policies, but you know, it's hard to sort that out. Yeah, I mean, that may happen. A third party could win. It's not impossible. I mean, the Libertarian Party actually could be doing a lot better if Weld was on the top of the ticket. I think. Weld's a serious politician. Not that Johnson isn't, but he's had some pretty lame answers to some questions that give me a little bit of pause. And he also just said that, you know, for the presidential campaign, he stopped smoking pot. That's great. At least he's honest. I guess he should get some credit for that.
We have one more question, or
One, two more, and then we
okay.
give John a break.
Anybody have any?
There was a question over here.
Okay.
Written out questions make me nervous.
If a high percentage of the women are for Hillary and a high percentage of the blacks for Hillary and a high percentage of the Hispanics for Hillary, why are the polls so close? And what is the category that Trump has beyond the Border Patrol and David Duke?
Well, fair question. First of all, Trump is doing well among white men. And he's doing well among people who have less than a college education, and that's still a big chunk of the country. And so those are the groups that he's excelling in right now. People have to realize that Trump won the Republican nomination, but he didn't start winning a majority of votes in any primaries until everybody dropped out. So he had a core of support, but it was not a majority. And in the general election, he's not yet cracked 45, basically. He's been sometimes in the high 30s, sometimes in the low 40s. He has a ceiling. I don't know where that ceiling is exactly, but it right now looks to me to be about 42, 43% of the vote. Partly for the reasons that I just cited. That is that he's not doing well among women, he's not doing well among African Americans, but he is doing well among white males, and also people without college educations. He's tapping into that anger. And he also, he's getting a lot of turnout in ways. He is generating enthusiasm. He is generating excitement. Diane Black, or one of members of Congress here from the state, I was giving a talk 3-4 weeks ago, and she was in the audience, and she and I talked afterwards. And she told a story that that I thought was pretty amazing. That when her primary took place in early August, which is when we had our Democratic and Republican primaries, she said she was stunned by the number of people who showed up to vote for Trump in the primary, but when they found out he was not on the ballot, they just left. They weren't voting for any other Republicans. They came to vote for Donald Trump. He has tapped into that. And so if you look at the polls, some polls give Trump a little bit higher support, some give less. The best polls that I think right now are about 5-point lead for Clinton. It's about right. But that's based on an assumption about who's likely to turn out. And if you think that enthusiasm is the predictor, which people sometimes do, then Trump starts to do better because his base is a little bit more enthusiastic than Clinton's. But enthusiasm didn't turn out to be a very good predictor in 2012. In fact, a lot of people thought Romney was going to win the election. Romney himself thought, his polls said that his own internal polls had him ahead because they were counting enthusiasm too much and that the turnout was not the way they anticipated it. So there is still some art here and some judgment about what to do. And we have a poll, we're releasing the results tomorrow for the state. It gives a horse race and all that kind of stuff. There's not going to be any surprises about who's ahead. But one thing we made a decision was we decided to not go to a likely voter model because we asked people if they're likely to vote and they all said yes, basically. And we know the turnout's about 50, 60% depending on, so we decided just to go to registered voters because we felt it was more reliable and just tell people, and if you want to predict the election, you don't need a poll for me to tell you who's going to win the state, right? That's not part of what's going on. But we do want to understand the vote more, and that's what the poll's about, and so we're going to focus on registered voters. But it's an issue. So one thing that Trump has going for him is this enthusiasm edge. It's not huge, but it's real. And so it's a good question. All of them are good questions.
Was there one more before we close?
I see. We're good. Oh, Cyril.
I do have one more.
Sure.
It's amazing the number of people that have said, I go through Davidson County and don't see many Trump signs.
No.
If you go out in the rural areas, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and that's where Trump's getting his support. In the cities here in the state, like Memphis and Nashville, Chattanooga, they're Clinton havens. But the suburban rings and then the rural areas, they're supporting Trump. A lot of the people who support Trump is just because it's the animosity towards Hillary Clinton that's so high. I mean, if you had Tim Kaine at the top of the ticket, I think you'd have a very different kind of outcome. If you had Mike Pence at the top of the ticket, I think you'd have a very different outcome. But we don't. And it's amazing to me the animosity towards Hillary Clinton, because she was pretty popular Secretary of State. But between the emails and some parsing of words and just bringing up old, the Clintons have been around so much. And again, she's rubbing really up against this idea of change. I mean, she is going to be, I really truly believe she'll be a competent president. A big crisis occurs, she's going to handle it just fine. All those things are true. But boy, the country wants change, and she's about the least change. If Jeb Bush and Hillary had been the two nominees, that would have been amazing, because neither one of them represent change. But with that, I appreciate you listening to me, and have a good night.
Thank you, John. Some of you may remember John spoke here in 2008. He was here earlier this year, but I borrowed a phrase from him that I've used many times, and that's the phrase raging moderate. John said he was a raging moderate. I like to consider myself that too. Thank you for coming back and for being here. We will continue next week, which should be interesting, and invite people. It's open to whoever. So thanks, Dr. Geer, and y'all have a good night.